I'm Judy Shaw for NYSE Floor Talk. Joining me today is Nikolas Schrobenhauser. He is Senior Director of Business Development at Infusive. Hi, Nikolas. Great to see you.
Hey, Judy. Nice to see you again. Thanks for having me.
A quick note to our viewers, this interview is for informational purposes only. The NYSE doesn't recommend any investments or investment strategies. All right, so Nick, in the last year, consumer spending patterns have been significantly disrupted. How does Infusive think about the health of the consumer going forward?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think I would draw people's attention to when we're thinking about the health of the consumer, not only in 2021, but across market cycles. And so breaking those two parts down into their underlying components, if we take a step back, we look at the big picture and we think about the health of the consumer in general, there's certainly some components of our investing strategy. And I think the last time you and I spoke, I mentioned what that was, but I'll sort of recap it here for simplicity's sake. Everything we do is underpinned by the understanding of psychology and human consumption patterns. And ultimately, what we've spent a lot of time researching and understanding is that consumers have always and will always buy the products and services that they know, that they love, that bring them happiness, or that make their lives easier. And so there's a persistence and a timelessness to that we think continues to make the value proposition for our strategy a fairly strong one. If we then kind of focus on 2021 more specifically, there are some things that we think make the case for the strength of the consumer this year and beyond. Not the least of which is that there's a ton of pent-up demand. People for the better part of 15 months have been prevented from doing a lot of the things that they would have otherwise done under normal circumstances, whether that be going out, shopping in retail locations, traveling, visiting new parts of the world, staying in hotels. And there's a considerable amount of demand to do all those things. Now that there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel, and there seems to be a little bit more of an effective rollout of vaccine distributions. If you couple that then with a massive uptick in excess savings accounts, ultimately what you're left with is a consumer that's got a ton of pent-up demand and a lot of cash in their pockets. So hopefully that'll benefit our strategy moving forward.
Okay, now how does the economic reopening affect the way Infusive thinks about investing in today's equity markets?
Absolutely. I think it's sort of a continuation of the themes that we've seen over the course of the last year, but with some new shades of coloration, really. And what I mean by that is that there is a continuation of what we would call the at-home winners, a lot of the more digitally focused names that we invest in, plus what we would call the reopening names. And there are some interesting components of data that we've seen come out recently that we think support this sort of reopening of the economy and an increase in demand and a return to normalcy. So if you were to look at recent searches for hotel accommodations within Google, that's seen a massive uptick over the course of Q1, kind of to a normalization of pre-COVID levels. Equally on OpenTable.com, which is a popular restaurant reservation website, we've seen reservations increase to pre-2020 and into 2019 levels, which certainly was not the case in 2020 when kind of those numbers were negative for a fair amount of time. So that gives us a lot of faith that the reopening of economies, both here in North America and around the world, should help bolster a strategy like ours. But in general, economies opening, that's good for business, certainly relative to the alternative, more people getting potentially back into the workforce, increasing their discretionary spending levels. And ultimately, those are all things that we think should benefit a strategy like ours, not only in the near term, but hopefully over market cycles as well.
All right, and finally, Nick, we live in an increasingly digital world. How do you see digital transformation, and do you think it's here to stay?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that. The digital universe is an area that Infusive is focused on for a long time. Certainly COVID-19 and the pandemic in general accelerated that as people were forced to kind of stay at home and consume things in a non-linear way. We would certainly say that that is here to stay. There was a quote recently from the CEO of PayPal, Dan Schulman, and he said he didn't really understand how we could ever go back to the way things were. And I think we would agree with that sentiment. Now, that's not to suggest that face-to-face consumption, what we would call linear consumption, is going to cease to be. There will always be a place for that. People will continue to want to travel, go out to restaurants, purchase things in store. But we've certainly seen a structural shift begun to take place that, as I mentioned, was accelerated by the COVID pandemic. And if you add to that these generational demographic shifts, most notably older members of the population, baby boomers, leaving the workforce and effectively leaving their highest discretionary spending years and being replaced by millennials and Gen Zers who are either coming into the workforce for the first time or hitting the peak of their careers, and as a result of that, also hitting kind of their peak consumer spending years. What we see is those are digitally native generations, right? These are people who were born into the age of the internet when iPhones and social media and websites and that kind of digital connectivity was already around. It certainly has increased over the course of their lifetime. But since they're becoming kind of the lead demographic, not only in the US, but around the world, we see digital consumption in general as being something that's going to be here to stay.
All right. Well, Nick, it was great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me on NYSE Floor Talk.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me again, Judy.